My name's Malcolm Hackett and I chair the board of BRI. Welcome to the first webinar of our 2025 series, Hardening Your Home for Bushfire. In this session, we have two outstanding presenters, Dr. Jack Cohen and Dr. Justin Leonard. Following their presentations, Jack and Justin will explore the issues raised in a panel session. Our objective is to provide information to help you harden your home against bushfire. This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, an independent, community-led, not-for-profit. Our mission is to improve community engagement in reducing bushfire risk by providing expert knowledge and promoting it to households in a timely and practical manner. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. BRI and our presenters acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands from which the presenters and you join us tonight, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples, their ongoing cultures, and 65,000-year connection to the lands and waters across Australia. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information, not advice. Our intention is to provide general information about risks to property, people, and animals. It's your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. This may be a sensitive topic for some people, and suggested services are shown on the screen. Thank you to our sponsors and supporters, Bendigo Community Bank branches, CFA, Warrandyte Riverside Market, City of Manningham, the Warrandyte Bridge over the Yarra, Nillumbik Shire Council, Davey Pumps, and the Resilient Canopy, which is a community resilience movement transforming Australia's response to social and climate challenges with communities at the helm. Our presenters are eminent researchers and industry experts. Jack is joining us from Montana in the USA. Welcome, Jack. Dr. Cohen created the Principles of Defensible Space, which led to the Firewise program, created the Home Ignition Zone, conducted research on ember ignitions and structure ignitability, helped develop the US National Fire Danger Rating System, and developed calculations for wildland firefighters' safe zones. His research and thinking has informed many similar Australian programs. Justin Leonard has dedicated his 28-year research career to the understanding of how bushfire risk to life and infrastructure can be managed. This research combines learnings from bushfire exposure experiments, post-bushfire survey investigations, and computer modelling of bushfire interactions with buildings. Justin has been a regular BRI presenter since we began in 2020, and our audience relates to and applies his information with vigour. You can turn on captions in the Zoom footer if you are having a problem with the sound level. Now, before we begin the presentations, could we hear something about how the two of you came to meet and your collaborations over the years? And perhaps Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, it's a really proud moment, I guess, to be able to present here with Jack. I guess we've knew about each other for quite some time before we managed to formally meet. But my first time of actually meeting with Jack, I guess, could be summed up in one word, and that's like validation. Like I guess you spend, many decades in your career sort of pursuing the innate understanding of what's really happening in these wildfire slash bushfires, and you come to these innate understandings and insights, and then you meet someone on the other side of the world that more or less has taken a very similar path. And it was kind of like we were comparing notes, and virtually every conclusion was identical. So I guess, yeah, that sums it up. This really feels validating to both share and present our sort of combined understandings, but it's not it's not through us sort of sharing things back and forward at all. It's actually we've just come to completely similar conclusions and understandings in completely different contexts, and the commonality between those two things is trying to understand fires and how they behave and impact around structures, and we're basically on the same wavelength right across those processes. I guess over to you, Jack. What's your sort of reflection on us interacting and finding each other?
Yeah, I can support everything you said. And in fact, as you were talking, I was thinking about our meeting. I think it was raining outside fairly hard. We were both members of the collaborative to do a review on the 2009 Victoria fires. And so we were, I think it was around dinner time or just before dinner time, and we were talking. And so I was making observations to you, and we had not collaborated at all before this. And to explain my particular situation, when I would explain what I was mentioning to you, I would just get blank stares in the US. People were not relating at all to what I was talking about with regard to structure ignition being the principal problem. And we started comparing the details of doing a post-fire investigation and what we were seeing and what that meant. And it was clear within minutes that we were seeing and interpreting the very similar kinds of results of our investigations exactly in the same way. And I think it probably helps that we're both engineers and that we're not thinking so much about the operation and, oh, gee, we could have saved more houses if we'd have had more engines, or pursuing that kind of line. It was more one of, well, this is what didn't burn around a destroyed home, and this is what it means, and this is what we're seeing. And it was, you would mention something and I would mention the same thing in support, and we were going back and forth with increased vigor in our discussion, because it seemed like both of us were starving for an intellectual discussion on what we had seen. And I would describe it that way. And it was an immediate kindredness, professional kindredness. And it was, as you said, extremely validating to have the same observations interpreted in the same way, halfway around the world, and totally independent.
Yeah, I remember that first time we spent together. Well, it's like burned into my memory.
It was. Oh my.
Right.
Anyway.
Thank you both. Jack, would you like to begin your presentation now then?
So the presentation I'm going to make can be described as how we can effectively prevent wildland urban fire disasters. And the way I do this is somewhat of a discovery process for the things I've seen and then interpret for you how that relates to how ignitions occur, and then go through a discussion with regard to where do we have choices? Where can we make effective decisions to reduce the risk, to prevent the ignitions, as well as to protect the communities? So let me begin by saying what I'm focusing on, and I'm using essentially US American terms. So wildland urban, what I'm going to be talking about is specific to wildland urban fire disasters. And for analysis purposes, a disaster is 100 or more homes. So what we find resulting is many homes, businesses, and other structures burned to total destruction during extreme wildfire conditions. And I want to emphasize this total destruction because it's extremely rare with standard structure protection response that we end up with nothing but mineral in the place of where there was a house. And that's rare. And we make all kinds of assumptions about how that happens that isn't true. So let me define terms. Wildfire, when I use the term wildfire, I'm talking about continuous burning vegetation in undeveloped landscapes. And when I'm talking about extreme wildfire, I'm talking about wildfires having a range of fuel types, not just the tree canopies, but those fires, whether grass and light bush or shrubs and closed canopy conifers. So the range of fuel types with spread rates and intensities that overwhelm fire suppression and control when fire suppression and control fails. When I'm talking about wildland urban fire, I'm talking about wildfire exposing and potentially igniting for community ignitions. And when I'm talking about urban fire, when I mention urban fire, I'm talking about fire spread that depends on the community burning. It's principally determined by burning structures. So, in keeping with the U.S. cohesive wildland fire management strategy, we need to manage inevitable wildland fire for fire resilient landscapes. That is to restore in North America, restore fire as an appropriate ecological process, as a natural disturbance. And then simultaneously, we need to have communities that are adapted to extreme wildfire occurrence. We need to prevent disastrous community fire destruction. And in this case, wildland fire is a natural hazard. So one of the things that is extremely important and related to fire as a natural disturbance, and this is very much the case in Australia, but 3 times longer in terms of people essentially modifying the landscape. So when European discovery and settlement in North America occurred, that significantly reduced wildland fire area burned as a sustaining ecological factor for most of the landscapes in North America. And then over a century of wildfire suppression, that has largely eliminated wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor, particularly, and I will focus on the Western United States, resulting in a condition that we have called the wildfire paradox. And that is the attempted wildfire exclusion has increased the potential for extreme wildfire conditions over extensive areas. Our fire suppression is postponing fire from a suppressible situation to one of extreme wildfire. It doesn't eliminate fire, it just postpones it. So to manage wildland fire as a natural disturbance, we need to accept wildland fire as an inevitable, appropriate, and essential ecological process requiring restoration at landscape scales in all fire regimes. Low intensity surface fire, low intensity surface fire, as well as high intensity. In the US, we have fire adapted ecosystems that typically produce high intensity canopy fire. Well, this presents a profound challenge to us. So the question is, how can we have wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor at landscape scales without having wildland urban fire disasters? So now let me address the inevitable wildland fire as a community threat, a natural hazard. So let's take a look at what's been going on in the US since 1991. And all of these incidents have 1,000 or more houses destroyed. And one of the things, so what I'm doing with this chart is to explain the social impression and the political initiative based on what has occurred over the last roughly 35 years. So interestingly enough, the decade of 1985 to 1994, 9,000 homes were destroyed, and we have incidents in a particular year, multiple incidents, where that is exceeded significantly. So when we look at the increase in homes destroyed, this graphic largely just explains the human reaction, the socio-political reaction that's going on in the US. So how has the US responded to this increasing trend of disasters? Well, with expanded national attention and funding to increase suppression and wildfire control. Basically, our current situation with wildland fire, the inevitable wildland fire, is pure reactive wildfire suppression and community fire protection. And we are not preventing wildland urban fire disasters that only occur during the extreme wildfire conditions when wildfire suppression fails. Basically, what we're doing is we're increasing our cost of failure. And at the same time, our obsession with suppression is completely ignoring wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor in the US. So, does that mean there's nothing we can do and wildland urban fire disasters are inevitable? And the answer is an absolute no. But we require understanding for how homes ignite during extreme wildland urban fire so we can see the opportunities for preventing wildland urban fire disasters. And what I'm talking about, revealing opportunities, it's revealing opportunities for the institutionalization of a different approach, an alternative, effective approach to preventing wildland urban fire disasters without necessarily controlling extreme wildfires. So when I present this, typically the reaction is, well, that's not realistic. So is it realistic? Well, let's find out. So let's take a look initially at the patterns of destruction that contradict our perception of wildland urban fire as a wildfire control problem. So our society's general misperception of how wildland urban fire disasters occur frames community wildfire risk principally as an extreme wildfire problem. So let me give you some examples from media reports and interviews. The firestorm descended like a dragon from hell on the foothill neighborhoods and laid them to waste. Well, there's one view. The wildfire swept through the community with a tsunami of flame. Completely physically inappropriate view. The wildfire literally exploded houses in flames, leaving destruction in its path. It was like a war zone. So all of these perceptions is that the wildfire sweeps through the community. The community is a victim, not a participant. Well, let's take a look at results, post-fire results, and find out if that is in fact consistent with what we find. So what do the patterns of wildland urban fire destruction tell us about the involvement of wildfire and the contribution of community structures to the destruction? So let's take a look at a post-fire photo from the Paradise destruction during the Camp Fire. This is in Northern California, US. And several days after these photos came out, journalists called me and asked me, can you explain this unusual pattern of destruction? And my immediate answer, because this is the typical pattern of destruction, and they were incredulous, but they couldn't figure out how something like this could happen. Well, the bottom line is commonly people see the destruction without seeing the rest, the unconsumed surroundings. I mean, all the rest. So let's take a look. This is my favorite because this surviving house survived without protection. And again, in the media, they called it the miracle house. Well, so in this scene, what else didn't burn? Well, yeah, the miracle vegetation. So typical patterns of wildland urban fire destruction do not support the perception that high-intensity wildfire flames sweep through communities. These homes ignited from lofted burning embers, the wildfire flames never got to the community. And in this particular case in Los Alamos, which was a highly visible destruction in the year 2000, these homes ignited with flame contact from low intensity surface fire spreading from the intense wildfire some distance away. So let's take a look at a video of the houses burning, but no wildfire by and large. The homes are burning hours after the wildfire passed the community. Intense wildfire never spread to this residential area. And what we see are houses burning, but not the tree canopies. And in a post-fire, you could walk down the street in the direction of the helicopter, and on your left, you would not have a clue that there was any wildfire and destruction. And on the right, all but a half a dozen houses were totally destroyed. And we can see that the same kind of thing happens in Australia. This is the results of Victoria fires in 2009. And we see multiple examples of the same thing. None of this was cherry-picked. These are so common a scene from either being there during or post-fire, whether it's in the US, Australia, or Europe. The reason I put this in is because these were fires in what I call the big tree forest in the US. This is in the northwestern portion of the coterminous US states. And these are all conifers with heights on the order of 30 meters or greater. and the same kind of pattern occurred. So the unconsumed tree canopies amid the total destruction indicates wildfire flames did not spread through the community. Burning trees did not ignite the homes. Burned trees that you see were ignited from burning homes. So although initiated by wildfires, wildfires do not spread through communities. Community fuels the structures and the vegetation within the community, in the immediate vicinity of the structures, continue fire spread within the community. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like when a community burns without the wildfire. So here we have an interesting incident that I happen to be on, and we have an intense wildfire spreading parallel, roughly parallel to the community at about 2:30 in the afternoon, at which point a low intensity surface fire spreads off the flank of the intense wildfire on the surface through a fuel treatment to make direct contact with a half a dozen houses on the wildland side of the first perimeter street, at which point they ignite, and an hour later at 3:30 in the afternoon, the wind is still blowing, and now it's embers from the houses burning into the rest of the community that spreads for another hour and a half until it runs out of houses. This destruction, this wildland urban fire destruction, was completely due to the burning structures. So let's make sure we understand that fire is a combustion process that occurs right at the surface of the fuel. So this is the familiar fire triangle: fuel, heat, and oxygen. In this particular case, they're exterior fires. They're outside, not compartment. And so oxygen is always available. So we're now talking about the fuel and the heat relationship. So as a combustion process, fire is not a thing that independently travels from place to place like tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, cyclones. It requires the fuel to ignite. Fire spreads based on the sustained fire spread requires a sufficiency of fuel and heat. And in this particular case, when we talk about houses, it's the house that's the fuel. So fire spreads when ignition requirements are met locally at adjacent fuels in a stepwise process, including extreme wildfires. Tree and shrub canopy fuel discontinuities commonly prevent continued intense wildfire flame spread. Well, let's take a look at that and recognize that fuel treatments and fuel breaks might change wildfire behavior within the treatment, but the question becomes one of, is that sufficient? And what we find is that those treatments that are meant to protect communities do not reliably enable wildfire control to protect communities during extreme conditions. So let's take a look at what we mean by a fuel break. This is the first perimeter street on this community. High intensity canopy fire is spreading from right to left, and the first line of streets on the first line of houses on the wildland side of the street are within the high intensity. But the high intensity canopy fire can't spread across roughly 13 meters of space. So total home destruction occurred on the left without any high intensity crown fire. It was burning embers that ignited spot fires on or immediately adjacent to the houses on the left side that continued for another 3 blocks all the way to the state highway. So this is the common scene when you're there. And what that means is that wildland urban fire is determined by meeting combustion requirements local to flammable materials of the structures and design, and thus creating insufficient fuel and heat of and at structures can prevent community fire destruction. But when we think about the approach, we need to recognize that the fuel are the homes and structures. The heat that's required for ignition and burning are the materials on and adjacent to the homes and structures. So that means the community, the structures within the community are the fundamental fuel participant that continues the fire within the community. So that means that wildland urban fire is a structure ignition problem, not a wildfire control problem, which of course, during extreme conditions, can't be controlled. So when we see a huge convection column like this on a high intensity fire, our general perception is that the big flames of intense wildfires do not heat objects over long distances. And that is not the case. Intense wildfires do not heat objects to ignition over long distances because fuel discontinuities and intense wildfire flame fronts can't meet across discontinuities the combustion requirements for spreading into and through the communities. Intense simultaneous heating across wide areas of structures does not occur. It's the local conditions that determine the home ignitions. So total destruction that we see here, we're looking through 3 houses totally destroyed, and this destruction does not indicate high intensity wildfire exposure. Look at all the green unconsumed vegetation in the surroundings. These homes ignited and freely burned to total destruction without available fire protection. And that's something that we don't normally experience because the response to a house that is burning tends to leave a lot of remnant material. It may be total destruction from an evaluation standpoint, but the walls and parts of the roof might still be there. In this case, it burns to mineral because it free burns. So local conditions were not sufficient for this home to ignite. Wildfire suppression was not necessary. In this case, local conditions were sufficient for home ignition and structure protection wasn't available. So that raises the question, how far is local? Well, the wildland urban fire research that I have done has determined through modeling, experiments, and post-fire examinations that local is defined as a home's ignition vulnerabilities to all sources of burning embers and adjacent burning materials within 30 meters, the house and the surroundings of 30 meters. The big flames beyond 30 meters can't meet the requirements for combustion for the duration of those big flames, which is short. So this area has come to be known as the home ignition zone, the HIZ, and it principally determines home ignitions during extreme wildfires. So home ignition zone conditions can be described as home ignition vulnerability in relation to all sources of burning embers and burning materials within the HIZ. And that's what determined these results. So when I say in relation, basically what I'm saying is that if you live in a house with a flammable wood roof, then you are so vulnerable that the wildfire doesn't even have to get there. All that has to get there are burning embers to ignite the wood roof, and you're going to experience, in one of these disaster situations, total destruction. On the other hand, if you live, and I'm being extreme, in a earth-covered bunker with nothing flammable exposed, the relationship there is you don't have to do anything and you're not vulnerable. Your vulnerability is so low that the wildfire can't produce an ignition. So the most effective fuel treatment for preventing home destruction and wildland urban fire disasters is within HIZs and collectively communities, not in wildlands. So how do wildland urban fire disasters occur? Well, let's start with severe fire conditions. And then given an ignition, we end up with rapid fire spread and or high intensities, the extreme wildfire. Frequently, we have a wildland fire and then the advent of severe fire conditions, and we end up with the same resulting extreme wildfire. And then if an urban area is exposed to this extreme wildfire and it's vulnerable to ignition, we end up with multiple simultaneous ignitions, which overwhelms structure fire protection. It's already overwhelmed wildland fire suppression. The resources cannot cover the exposure of ignition and the burning houses. Many homes are burning without attention. They free burn to total destruction, producing the disaster. So we have the extreme wildfire, and the extreme wildfire, again, and an important point here is that wildland urban fire disasters have only occurred during extreme wildfire behavior, those disasters being 100 or more homes. And the extreme wildfire behavior in relation to fire suppression capability can occur as high intensity crown fire with high growth rates and in a continuous conifer forest, or in grass and light shrubs with medium intensity. It's on the surface, but the intensities and the very rapid spread and growth rates overwhelm control. So we have an extreme wildfire, but if houses don't ignite and burn, then our suppression, our ability to cover the exposure, is increased to the point of where we can attend any sustained ignitions that do occur, and we've prevented the disaster. So available research indicates a structure ignition approach that creates ignition-resistant HIZs and collectively ignition-resistant communities can effectively prevent wildland urban fire disasters. So let's take a look at a summary of what I've just presented. Extreme wildfires are inevitable. Wildland urban fire disasters only occur during extreme wildfires when wildfire suppression and control fails. Extreme wildfires initiate home and community ignitions, but they do not spread through densely developed communities. Community fire destruction largely occurs after wildfire ignition influence ceases. That is, most destruction is occurring when there is no significant wildfire adjacent to the community. Home and structure ignitions are determined within the home ignition zone. Ignition-resistant homes and collectively communities can prevent wildland urban fire disasters without necessarily controlling extreme wildfires. Well, now let's take this summary and use it to frame disastrous community destruction during extreme wildfires as a community wildfire risk issue. So let's start with primary risk factors of community wildfire risk. The first risk factor, the ignition hazard. the extreme wildfire exposure. And then what's the ignition response of the structures and community? That is the home and structure ignition vulnerability. And then the third is the ignition intervention. That is structure protection capability. And that produces the community wildfire risk. Well, where do we have decisions? What can we control? So if we're going to do wildfire risk, community wildfire risk reduction, we have to be able to control portions or all of these risk factors. Well, what about extreme wildfire exposure? Well, we have abundant empirical evidence without any trend that indicates that wildfire control is anything but unreliable to eliminate exposure. No choice. What about ignition response? Well, from the research we've done, at community ignition and fire spread resistance can eliminate most ignitions. But fireproofing a community is not a reasonable expectation, which means we have to have structure protection capability. And the interesting part is that it requires sufficient ignition resistance in the community in order for community fire protection capability to be enabled. So fire protection depends on ignition and fire spread resistance. So let's talk about this community fire protection risk factor. So the effectiveness is enabled by community ignition resistance. However, community protection effectiveness requires tactics appropriate for the simultaneous wide area potential for some sustained ignitions. We can eliminate many of the ignitions, but we can't fireproof. And this context, this very specific context to wildland urban fire requires numerous highly mobile small units, a small group of firefighters per unit, 2, 3, maybe 4, widely distributed through the community with smaller amounts of water than the inundation approach we use with urban engines. And the urban engines provide backup for what houses do become involved. So the fire research and risk analysis indicate that wildland urban fire disasters most effectively are defined as a home and structure ignition potential, not a wildfire control problem. Effective approach for preventing wildland urban fire disasters is to create ignition-resistant HIZs and collectively ignition and urban fire-resistant communities. And wildland fuel treatments do not stop wildfires from spreading to communities during extreme wildfires. The greatest fuel treatment effect on fire is within the fuel treatment, and that means treating the home ignition zone fuels, the house and its immediate surroundings within the community. So these homes didn't require wildfire control to survive. Wildland urban fire disasters can be most effectively and practically prevented by creating community ignition resistance, not by attempting to control inevitable extreme wildfire, of which we have no choice. So interestingly enough, and rather ironically, we still have a major issue of fire resilient landscapes, that is sustaining fire adapted ecosystems. So restoring wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor at landscape scales, ironically, will require ignition resistant communities. So making our homes and communities ignition resistant means having wildfires without wildland urban fire disasters. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. My head is spinning with all of that, particularly those graphic photographs that make the point so well. Justin, would you like to begin your presentation, please?
I'd love to follow in Jack's footsteps. Yeah, thanks so much for that really articulate and clear delivery on the issue, and it's incredible how highly aligned and relevant it is to the context of house loss and the motivation to focus on those key aspects around loss from the perspective of what the homeowner can and should ideally take. So yeah, I've called it bushfire and wildfire shared perspective, because we obviously have very similar focus and words, but we have our naming conventions and our units of measurement that are our nuance. But I hope the audience can sort of appreciate those slightly different ones and really start accessing the deep detail and resources that are available in advice from the various US sources that Jack's played such a major role in creating. So I guess I wanted to sort of bring you back to and remind you of those sort of advice and guides around what we call best practice house design and preparation, and those actions around ember attack, radiant heat, surface fire, consequential fire, which are those objects around houses, tree strike, wind, debris accumulation. They're all really key aspects that Jack did a great job of identifying and profiling in terms of their relevance. These are all those factors that you find in our best practice guides and some of the previous BRI presentations I've put forward. And I guess to recognize this question of, well, what does it take for us to get to that point where we're really concerned about and worrying about urban spread, fire spread within urban areas, or this word of conflagration, which Australia has experienced and does experience. I'd say roughly a third of our asset losses across Australia are in these big bushfires are attributed to the fact that it's once it started promulgating into the urban environment and houses are burning each other down and whatnot, it's highly attributable. So it's really getting to that, what combination of things actually set us up to say, now we're concerned that things can spread within the urban environment. And it's high winds, dry enough conditions, and that an ignition source and human settlement. And I guess, high winds, how high? Well, once you get to around 75 kilometers an hour, you're starting to really push fires with it, and I guess get to that point where you could have damaging factors just associated with the winds themselves. And I guess it's really important to also highlight that dry conditions that prime the bush and allow those surface fuels to activate and the bush to actually burn are exactly the same conditions that are drying out the homes and priming them for being potentially ignited. So when we think about how ignitable a house might be, we have to think about how ignitable a house might be when it's really dry. So think about floorboards that have shrunk and you can drop coins between the floorboards. That kind of dryness is at another level that really makes ember access and ignitability quite significant. And just to sort of deep dive into this home ignition zone process, if you haven't sort of had a look through some of the US content, I've sort of ripped this off the National Fire Protection Association website, but it really provides that that staging of zones. I think I've previously referred to it as the onion ring approach, where the most important zone is the one closest to and involving your house. So this immediate zone, or zone zero, it's sometimes referred to within the within the literature, is the most important zone, and you have to get it right. And then you have the, I guess, opportunity to then consider the relevance of the zones as you move further out. So in a zone, we're talking about, your 0 to 1.5 meters is, and that includes the house itself. So that's just that intimate nature of the house, its materials exposed, and what's immediately up against that structure. The next zone out, the intermediate zone, 1.5 to 10 meters. And I really enjoyed hearing from Jack that he mentioned that 13-meter house-to-house spread. We pretty much landed on 12 meters in Australia, but I'm not going to divide the difference between 12 and 13. I think we've both basically landed on that innate understanding of really where you get to that threshold of one house having a reasonable go at its neighbour is in that 12 to 13 meters or less realm. And then you're looking out really in that 10 to 30 meters, which is you start thinking more about vegetation and its sort of aggregate effect on the structure. And really it is honing in on all of those key elements, debris landing and building up on your roof, neighbouring structures and sheds, where you park your wheelie bin, where fences are proximal to structures and what they're made out of. Are they combustible and close and therefore a major risk? Are they non-combustible and therefore offer barriers to radiant heat, surface fire spread, even a reasonable radiant heat barrier for structure transfer if they are tall enough or comparable in height to the actual buildings that are potentially interacting. And really in terms of that, the prioritization of most prevalent to least really fit into this framing really well. Ember attack is the predominant mechanism for ignition of both the house or its surrounding elements that then impact the house. Debris accumulation works synonymously with embers. Surface fire, that low intensity surface fuel exploitation, brings ignition potential to all of those elements and the house itself. The consequential fires, all of those elements burning from the result of those first three actions that then put a longer duration and locally intense fire against the structure again, which is yet another onslaught. So we're not talking about short, brief burnout type activities. We're talking about long burnout events like a wheelie bin burning to completion, or a boat, or a spa, or a pile of wood, or a retaining wall. These things really bake away at trying to exploit the elements that the house is made out of. And then all of the typical ones that come from that formal fire front yourself, radiant heat, flame front contact. But don't forget that radiant heat can be that background that comes from not only potentially wildfire fronts, it can come from an adjacent house, an element further away. This radiant heat is priming and warming all of the elements in the urban scene and making it even more possible for those higher order processes of ember attack and surface fire to exploit and ignite those elements. So there's a big sort of concurrency of these things happening. And then right down the list is direct wind actions and tree strikes, which definitely happen, but certainly happen when you really turn that wind dial up to the maximum. And so the highest and lowest priority should use that sort of prevalence and priority go hand in hand. And I guess this idea of what you can tackle from a house design perspective, Jack really articulated that idea well, that an ember attack is not something you can eliminate by laying the landscape bare of any ember source. It's just technically impractical. Embers travel too far and are too prolific. You tackle ember attack from a house design perspective. You make it resilient, resistant to ember attack. Debris accumulation, bit of both. Surface fire, you can see how things can be mixed processes. And right down the other end, of course, tree strike. Do you design a house that can handle that could handle an impact of the thing? Technically possible, but you're probably better off tackling it on the tree side. So let's have a look at this home ignition zone zooming in to the favorite one, which is the 0 to 1.5 meters. It really is the most critical. I can't overemphasize that as a guiding principle. If you haven't got your house and its immediate surroundings in complete order, all the rest of the work in the broader landscape is a dramatically diminished relevance and usefulness. You have to eliminate the problematic items that are going to interact with this structure or have an incredibly robust, tough structure that can handle those adjacent interactions. Jack, I think, really fantastically framed that relationship between house design and appropriate immediate surrounding elements. That it has to be a high degree of synergy between those two things. And that's elements that are fixed in place, like retaining walls or fences, but also the elements that you have the discretion of where you put them, like vehicles and wheelie bins and wood heaps. And never forgetting that really it's this structure. So roofs, gutters, windows are all really key things. And the surface fuels and near ground processes as well. So things like, gravels and paths around houses make so much sense. And let's not forget that all houses aren't created equal. And I guess there's two principal ways of looking at those structures. You can think of it as a skin deep kind of model where you're really hoping and expecting that external facade, external materials to be the ultimate and primary barrier. But if you're fortunate enough to, say, be building a house from scratch, or you've managed to have a house that has more inherent non-combustibility, you can exploit this type of principle where you're using the entire envelope itself, which it can offer significantly more resistance than simply the external cladding, which may or may not be mechanically compromised or whatnot. So you've got sort of more layers of redundancy in that non-combustible roof spaces and external processes. So yeah, it really comes down to considering all of those potential actions and looking out for those weak links and exploitable processes. So back to things like the best practice guide to jog your memory on how those actions interact with structures. And I guess how we could sort of delve into some specific extra, say, useful tips. So things like if I was asked sort of how to harden a roof to be, really robust here, I'd say let's try a few novel things. Wind is an ever-present factor. Google what it's like to prepare a roof for a cyclone season in the far north. I mean, we're talking about really intense, potentially damaging winds, even ones where the fire creates some extra wind intensity. You'll actually find that the advice is highly relevant for bushfire as well. So things like, are your roofing screws old and rusty? Could they be upgraded, or could we put extra screws in with cyclone-rated washers under them so that those roof sheets remain intact throughout a fire event? How well is the ridge capping held down and sealed for ember attack? Is there an opportunity to sort of strap your framing to to your roof a bit more, which is starting to get a little bit more technical. But it is a consideration. And those gutters and downpipes, you know, making sure they're clean, but also looking at ways to cleverly prevent ember ingress under roof sheets and tile edges by meshing over between the actual gutters and the sheets themselves, and of course trim overhanging trees and things like that. So those sorts of advice and guidance are nice synergies between that sort of cyclone preparation idea and in fences as well. So let's consider, you know, combustible fences within a few meters of the house is really a no-no. Like the house ignition zone parameters are really clear around that process, and all of our guidance are as well. You know, at really a few meters is just simply too close to even a hardwood and a softwood fence. Non-combustible fences, in contrast, are extremely effective and can really help build barriers and confidence between elements that you might need in the landscape and your structure. But don't forget that fences are also barriers and aren't necessarily can hamper fire suppression activities. So where Jack sort of identified that question around, we need to reduce the number of houses that are burning, and it is reasonable that some degree of fire suppression will be needed, but at least they won't be necessarily overwhelmed. Or making those suppression activities as able as possible by having effective access is particularly important. So pay attention to where gates and how fences do support or hinder that process. And guess what? Fences have wind load ratings too. So if you wanted a fence that really wanted to stand up and do its job during a fire event itself, look up what cyclone rated fencing actually is. It's some extra screws. It's a slightly more metal gauge. It's a tougher, you know, longer build life type fence. That might be a really relevant thing for yourselves. If we move out into that next zone, the intermediate zone, so we're talking the 1.5 to 10 odd meters, but call it 10, 12, 13, it's in that realm. It's really what is in this zone that's going to create those large heat sources and spray a lot more embers on the home. You can do a lot just to moderate ember attack just by reducing those local sources. So this is like bark mulch on the ground and whatnot. But really pay attention, slightly less critical realm, like you can have small combustible elements in this zone. But it's really hard to sort of give you that ultimate rule of thumb that says, you know, this small object at this distance. It's more probably better to build up a big spreadsheet of, you know, this particular object, ideally greater than this distance, this particular object, because all things aren't created equal. And I guess in that separation, you know, what do we do? Like, we could talk about wood piles and how far, or how big is a wood pile. We could talk about empty fiberglass spars or boats and how far they need to be away. There's good advice, but what I would really, I guess, encourage you to do is do your homework on each of these items. Ask the questions about every item that could burn, and sort of distance it accordingly, and sort of, you know, engineer your urban layout in a really sort of cohesive way, noting that it's the few elements you miss or overlook that's probably going to define the ultimate risk if you do a really reasonable job. Wind direction does play a real role. You can imagine a house might be quite a little bit more effective at igniting its neighbour if the flames are blown onto or towards the neighbouring house. And you need to sort of think about predominant wind directions as well. Also noting that wind strength plays a really weird role too. So wind is both trying to fan a fire in a particular direction, but it's also actually cooling a house that might be receiving significant radiant heat. So it sort of has some pros and cons in that scenario. And in fact, what we've found is when we're realizing that structures can burn other structures down out to those 12, 13, 14 meter distances, we're actually finding that that's happening under relatively low wind conditions where the winds are not fanning and cooling the target house that's receiving the heat as much. So you tend to get a bit more spread or more effective spread at those sorts of significant distances. And, you know, of course, let's keep considering how, not just how intense something might burn at its peak, but how long they might take to burn out. And in the context of sort of thinking about everything interacting with a house, it's also quite relevant and useful to really think about paths and access. You know, if you have to leave your house because it's started to become involved, which would be a really unfortunate scenario, what objects are you moving past to get to a safer location, or you know, to be able to get away from the house to a more open area? And then in that very last zone, which is the sort of 10 to 30, it's really down to sort of vegetation and those other questions. And vegetation is a question in that, yes, it's a source, but don't forget vegetation and mature trees are quite effective wind attenuators, and they're quite effective radiant heat barriers from the broader wildland areas and those larger flames further out. So it's not about you know, ground zero clearing to these 10 to 30 meters. It's about strategic vegetation, leaning towards lower threat vegetation, not thinking that mature trees in themselves are the risk, which I think Jack's really effectively articulated, and recognizing that the vegetation in this 10 to 30 meter zone is your friend in terms of keeping shade and retain moisture in the environment, and actually lowering the rate that the landscape and your house dries out as you enter into these fire seasons. And I'll leave it there with that reminder image of the house ignition zone. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Terrific drilling down into the elements there. Before we move to our panel discussion, a short promo for BRI. Please, everyone, encourage your friends and community group families who are living with bushfire risk to register to become a BRI subscriber. It means you'll both get access to information, but also we'll send information about upcoming events. Follow us on our Facebook page and share the posts. And we certainly thank the numerous groups and individuals around Australia who've shared our posts. If you live in Victoria, New South Wales or South Australia, then there's an opportunity with our raffle to win a Davey single impeller firefighting pump. And finally, you might consider making a donation if you value the work that we're doing and the information that we're providing. I have found the presentations really stimulating, and I'm sure our audience has as well. But I guess there may be some questions you want to ask each other or points you want to make about one another's presentations.
One of the things that leapt out that was there's always something fresh in the presentation was that you nailed on that idea that it was 13 meters was about the distance that one house could reasonably take out its neighbour, or that the prevalence of structure to structure spread, where it was clear that it was just one structure to another, not leapfrogging through, that 13 meters was about your number. I guess we came up with a very similar number, and we noticed that it was related to a particular fire in Wye River where there were regulated houses up to 12 meters away from houses that burnt down. So they already had some radiant heat and resistance, but they were pretty much at the point where they would go, or they were about to go and had gone at that 12-meter mark, and the wind levels were really low, because it all happened sort of once the wind had dropped away. So this sort of, I find the community asks quite often, how far is enough, and what do you got to do when you're closer? But I was fascinated that you came up with that intuitive sort of 13-meter measure.
I was asked decades ago to do a radiant heat distance with regard to between structures. And so what I did this was the state of California that asked it, and I was living in California at the time. So what I did was to look at the length of time that a fully involved wall was burning, and looked at the radiant heat from a sort of a maximum view from the burning wall to a wood wall. And that's where I came up with, if it was 1 story, it was 8 meters, where you had pretty assured ignition. For a 2-story structure, it was between 12 and 13 meters. I think I sent you the investigation report on the Lytton fire in British Columbia, where we found a significant radiation containment, essentially, from non-flammable cladding. In this particular case, it was masonry stucco. And the evidence, so you come onto the scene, and of course, what we've sort of cued on was a survivor that was between 2 destroyed structures, fully destroyed. And we got there, and the immediate scene that we saw was that the walls had caved in over the debris field of the burned structure. So basically what happened was the structure's burning, the cladding isn't. And not only isn't the cladding burning, but it's staying in place until it burns through enough rafters to where the roof caves, and then that pulls the walls in. And in this particular case, that was exactly what happened. The unburned, the non-combustible walls were pulled in. Well, the effect was not covering the smoldering debris field. The effect was there was no flame exposure from the walls of the structure that was burning to the surviving structure. The entire radiant portion of the flame that was exposing the survivor was all above the eave line.
And if it happened to have doors or windows, it would be pluming out through those, but that's a small area rather than the entire
Precisely.
structure.
Yeah, precisely. And of course, my comment on that for code people, I mean, this is easy to code. Ignition is not easy to code because because of all the things that people just living there produce that's uncodable. But in terms of coding structure to structure flame spread, that's a readily codable issue. And so I'm asked about windows. And so basically, and oh, by the way, tempered windows aren't going to solve your problem, not with flame contact. And so the point being that you have limited window space between structures or none, and so that becomes negligible. and you don't have flame exposure.
Yeah. So your reference to readily codify, I will totally agree. The ways you address that across a residential boundary from one house to another is very easy to specify and solve. I guess we're struggling here in Australia because we don't actually, the regulations don't actually acknowledge that as one of the things you need to design against in bushfire regulation. It just assumes ambivalence on the other side of a boundary because of some sort of concept of beyond the regulations control. But that's more of a political challenge than a technical one. But I like this point that as you harden a house or make it inherently non-combustible externally, you're not only building that resistance for interactions of the fire and the landscape on it, but you're actually improving, reducing the intensity of its ability to emit to neighbouring properties. So you're kind of getting a really nice double whammy for simply moving towards a more appropriate, inherently non-combustible clad or framed and clad building.
Well, and exactly. And so one of the, in the US in particular, one of the recommendations I make is using fiber cement siding. Sometimes it goes through the trade name of Hardy, James Hardy plank, but basically it's a non-combustible material. And people say, well, geez, that's expensive. Well, have you bought cedar siding recently, in the US, and that's hardly cheap. And the bottom line is you can get the fiber cement panels and siding boards and trim boards, although apparently they've just quit producing trim boards, which is annoying. But you can basically do your boxing and your wall cladding in non-combustible material. And if it's installed properly, it will hang there. It won't collapse.
Yeah,
and it's difficult to burn through walls.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that kind of construction approach being a reasonable way to tackle both regulation and a good approach to design. But it does raise that quite peculiar difference between, say, California's typical building construction approach, which is almost universally or inherently a lightweight framed approach. And I guess that relates to tradition, but it also relates to your earthquake risks and things where you need quite light roofs and quite a compliant house to handle both the earthquake risks and your typical ways of building. I guess we in Australia could do build that way quite often, but historically we also have quite a prevalence of brick or brick veneer, or sort of moving towards a high degree of masonry cladding as a default, which I think's helped us to a degree, but certainly our regulations aren't inferring or requiring that as an essential scenario in bushfire-prone areas. So we're kind of very, very interested in, I guess, where the lightweight build solutions are effective in the US, because they're going to really help us with those lower cost builds over here in Australia.
Wait a second, guys. Let's be careful about using these canonical fire protection engineering kinds of tests and that are out of context of the wildland urban fire problem. These guys are doing particularly Eastern US kinds of compartment fire for coding kinds of testing that is completely out of the context of the exterior and possibly venting interior kinds of ignitions from burning embers, as well as the exterior exposure to flame contact. And so one of the things I've been trying to do in the US is to get my fire protection engineering colleagues to quit looking at it from what they've been taught and maybe did for UL, Underwriters Laboratory, and start getting their head into the wildland fire context.
No, that's very insightful and an interesting perspective for Australia, because I guess one of the weird things that I guess we kind of accidentally stumbled on in Australia is we prolifically just simply have non-combustible roofs. So our roofs are pretty much either steel, corrugated steel, profiled steel, or ceramic tiles. So we've kind of dodged any question or legacy about whether wood shingles or bituminous coverings are either extremely rare and very unusual, and sort of don't sort of navigate through the regulation as a reasonable path currently in Australia. So we've dodged a bullet in terms of the peculiarities of that, but you know those roofs don't cheat bushfire necessarily just because they're non-combustible, because they both have opportunities for gaps and access into roof spaces for those exploitable embers. So at least it helps us focus on those appropriate things.
When I came up with the 5 foot, 1.5 meter, no combustion, basically you don't want any combustion. And this is particularly, I want to emphasize smoldering combustion as well. So I was noticing, both from my own experience as well as doing investigations, as well as being on fires, when the structures were being exposed, that we have there was a prolific level, particularly in California and the southeastern US, a prolific amount of combustible material that was used for landscaping, like pine needles and, unbeknownst to most people, the ice plant succulent that was planted in Southern California around houses, that has a nice green succulent top to it, and it's just nothing but dead material underneath. And so I was watching how burning embers were igniting and potentially just smoldering, spreading smoldering up to where there might have been stucco siding, but under the weep strip, there was access and dead material to the base plate and the subsheathing of the wall, which was highly vulnerable to continued sustained ignition, first smoldering combustion that then hours later, maybe the next day, ended up being flame involvement. And so where this came from was pretty much just from experience and looking at what was burning and how far away do you need low flames, like from pine needles, and that don't burn for very long, as well as smoldering. So you don't want it continuous, and you don't want long burning kinds of fuels there. And my rule of thumb is, if you have flame contact on the structure, that potential, you need to remove it. Flame contact on a structure is a really bad idea. Now, when you get to masonry, like brick, or where you've got covering of masonry stucco or fiber cement, it becomes a performance issue. And for the assessors, not so much the rules. So the recommendations that Justin put forth are something where you don't really have control over, so this becomes a management issue with regard to how ignitions occur. But assessment people need to have enough subject matter expertise in order to recognize when you have a masonry wall that you can greatly reduces the ability to have an ignition at that location. So there is a management reality as well as a physical ignition reality. And from my experience, the people doing assessments and the people trying to manage the wildland urban fire problem need to understand this performance, this relationship of the source and the materials and design of the structure. And the reason for that is because when you walk onto a property, from my opinion of being an assessor, of doing an assessment, my attitude is that I take ownership of the homeowner's situation. And to be extreme, if the homeowner tells me, if you recommend cutting this tree down that we love, you can leave now. Well, so when I've arrived at the house, my mission is to keep the house from burning down, not to get into an argument about this is my rule and you better follow it. And so then at that point, what I have to have enough subject matter expertise to show them how that tree is very likely going to have a green canopy with their house destroyed. So what is the participation of the tree? All the crap that it drops on and around the house. And so my recommendation is you have to work to keep that tree. You have to remove seasonally, multi-seasonally, all the stuff that is going to contribute to your ignitability from that tree, but don't cut it down.
I'll offer one small anecdote to really back in that idea of why that 1.5 meters, 5 feet means so much. It is observationally, it just seems like a really convenient and appropriate distance to consider. And there's one anecdote I'll offer where we went to a surviving structure that was built to regulation. So it had masonry cladding, it had toughened glass windows. It was quite well, excuse me, hard. And it was only about a month old since they'd occupied it for a month before this fire came through. And the garden bed, there was a garden bed under a window that had no plantings in it at all, but it was hard up against this masonry structure, slab on ground, so no access, subfloor, anything like that. But it was a floor to ceiling window, and they'd put pine tan bark down in that garden, and the garden bed was 1 meter deep and the width of the window. The tan bark burnt, and it melted and charred the blinds through the toughened glass window to the point that the house nearly took off. So it was at the absolute threshold. So that's just tan bark on the ground, 1 meter depth out from the thing is enough to threaten an otherwise really well considered and designed house. That's why that inner zone and being ruthless about it is absolutely critical.
I think these presentations are very encouraging, because they tell you that first off, as a homeowner, you can take steps yourself to make your house less vulnerable, but also something which doesn't often enter the discussion, which is if you cooperate with your neighbours, share the knowledge, then you'll be able to make your neighbourhood safer. And and it seems to me that that next step is often a difficult step for people. The discussion with neighbours, the talking about where the boats and the cars are going to be parked, and those sorts of things. But there's opportunity there for people to reduce their risk massively.
Well, let me just make a comment with regard to, so when I talk to fire protection engineers, and particularly city planners that deal with emergency management and fire marshals, etc., when they start to complain about homeowners, my immediate question to them is, why are you expecting homeowners to know more about this problem than you do? And why are you, how is it that you're expecting homeowners to ignore your statements of guarantee that we'll have an engine in every parking, in every driveway to protect you, instead of telling them, we can't protect you without your engagement. It takes your engagement and your understanding of how to maintain your ignition resistance in order for us to be effective. And that message is not dominating the conversation.
I certainly do love this idea that I think you touched on there, Malcolm, which is you could come together with your neighbour around how you collectively can achieve so much more than an individual's effort on either side of the fence. And sort of, the way you might have a conversation about, well, we've got to upgrade the old fence. Where do we go from here? I was thinking also of, avoiding putting these things between my house and the fence for my own benefit, but it probably is going to help at both our situations. If we can make our houses as resistant to each other, the mutual risk of burning each other down is dramatically reduced. There's just so many interesting, I guess, positive conversations about acknowledging that you're in a mutual risk scenario.
Certainly, showing these presentations and then talking about it would, you would hope, give people some ideas about what they can do together. One of the things in Australia, of course, is we've got a lot of eucalypts, and Jack, when you were talking, you were mentioning conifers, but I guess parts of California have got a lot of eucalypts as well. But does our bushland, does it make any difference to the risks, or are they similar despite the different sorts of vegetation?
Well, the experience that I've had is that eucalypts have a very specific kind of contribution to intense fire behavior, rather different than the typical closed canopy conifer. But in both cases, during extreme conditions, you're going to get long-range spotting, long-range burning ember lofting, and spot ignitions within the community. In Southern California, there are community areas that are surrounded by the native chaparral, but then as it comes into the community, it's basically some kind of like blue gum eucalyptus. And what I've found is very similar to the photo that from Kings Lake, Victoria, that I showed, where that's total destruction, and yet the scorched but unconsumed tree canopies are still there. And so now I'm going back to roughly 2003 in Southern California, where the principal destruction was occurring due to flammable wood roofs and the neighbors that were on the order of 15 meters away or more with composition shingles survived, and the wood roofs have multiple ignitions on them, and there is no involvement of the less dense eucalypts around them. So in many cases, I think we're talking about blue gum, and the issue maybe is strip bark that flies in the convection column, but we're really not talking about significant crown fire, certainly in Southern California, in the eucalyptus.
What we've talked about is there's something there for individual homeowners. There's something there for the neighbours and communities to address, but there's also something for councils and fire agencies, I suppose, to address in terms of getting people to think so differently about what they can do and what they should do. Do you think that it's beginning to happen, Justin, in Australia?
I think the idea of, we've used terms like, why don't you aim for a best practice approach, not just comply to some guidelines and to minimum regs. And I think really the nub of that question is, how do we describe and celebrate the gaps that we have in our current setup? So, like, our regulation doesn't currently address or put any provisions in for a structure trying to burn its neighbour's structure down on the other side of a boundary. Like, a really open and honest conversation that regulation is either like why it's a gap isn't really the question. Maybe regulation should close off on that, but the fact that it's a gap and that the problem is more borne and has to be understood and borne by the community are all of those key conversations I think we really have to honestly have. And I think the way sort of Jack is sort of highlighting the gravitas of the factors at play, and the fact that many of those things come back to the actions and decisions of people in building and maintaining their structures, is that underlying premise. So that then is encouraging, well, what's the complete list of these factors that we're receiving once we receive a regulated house, or once we buy an old legacy house that doesn't even have any benefit from regulation? What are we up against here, and what is an appropriate way to sort of triage or prioritize that list from the most relevant and biggest bang for your buck sort of upgrades and mods, to right down to the residual risk sort of process?
Are there any particular takeaways that either of you want the audience to really grasp, to really take away? Perhaps one or two each.
Go for it, Jack. Unless you need some thinking time.
I'm not sure I have a capstone kind of hook statement. Your last comment reminded me of, anecdotally, of an experience where a longtime friend had accompanied me on one of the pilot communities for Firewise, and it's lunchtime, and we're sitting on the tailgate of the lorry, the truck. And he says, well, this really isn't, this assessment stuff isn't really rocket science. And I looked at him and I said, no, it's much harder. It's social science. And he looked at me and he said, oh, we're screwed. And I guess what I'm getting at is that the physics is pretty straightforward. I mean, as long as you get away from the notion that we're going to predict exactly what the future event is going to be, which does us no good whatsoever. I mean, it's totally, not only can't you do it, but it doesn't help us because the amount of time that it takes us to prepare is way longer than the potential for the fire to expose us. So you have to match the scale both spatially as well as temporally. And that means you have to prepare. And the more you have to change of materials and design of your structure, the more you have to prepare ahead of the event. Okay, having said that, this notion of cooperation in high density development and especially and I'm talking now from a US perspective, my own probably, our obsession and funding of control is a fundamental failure. You know, this idea of controlling rather than living with is a fundamental problem with becoming effective. We have too damn much money to throw at our failures with the idea of, well, if we could just control the wildfire, we wouldn't have a problem. Well, that perspective is a problem.
So I guess your sort of comments around social science being a lot harder than rocket science, I could definitely relate to that. So that's why I tried to get new people on my research team that were more humanistic than me. But I think that really hits on a nub for me in that in your presentation today, you really left nowhere for someone to hide that is espousing the attitude that there's nothing they can do about their structure, and that there's no, I guess, opportunity for that person to have a retrospective view that the conditions were so bad that anything they did probably wasn't going to be effective, which I find is quite a natural and prolific coping strategy for people to deal with that have had a major loss. Like, my house is gone. A really convenient narrative to say, to cope with the fact that of a total loss, it's a massive emotional challenge, is to say, well, there was probably nothing I could have done. And unfortunately, that person is in a situation where they're probably not going to become proactively motivated to build a better thing back, because it unfortunately clashes with a convenient narrative that there probably wasn't something they could have done. So I think that's a good framing for how community should and could come together to overcome that kind of convenient ambivalence and be more sort of collectively realistic and own the problem in a way. And for the enlightened portion of the community, maybe that's a sort of an opportunity or an effort to try to shift the dial a bit for the people that are trying to conveniently describe their way out of having to do something, or recognizing that they're seriously in the middle of that.
Yeah, what you're describing is the victim syndrome. And as it turns out, natural reality doesn't give a damn for victims. And so we have a choice. We can either be victims, which is reinforced in our society here, or we can be engaged and adaptive, which were the first peoples, indigenous peoples, when Europeans got here. And their success is evidenced by their existence and their ease of existence in many cases. And that goes for Australia even more, because it's 3 times the length of time of our current evidence for North America.
On that note, I think we'll conclude. Can I thank you both for just so stimulating a presentation and discussion. Jack, it's been wonderful to have you on the call with Justin. I'd like to thank our sponsors before we finish. The Bendigo Bank Community Bank branches, the Resilience Canopy, the CFA, the Warrandyte Riverside Market, Davy Pumps, the City of Manningham, and Nillumbik Shire Council. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Max Garner, Jason McFadden, John Huff, Max Coleman, Peter Mildenhall, Mark Gravel, Rob Reed-Smith, Linda Snell, Greg Harry, Bryony Towers, Scott Lambshed, and Richard Fagan for their commitment in conducting and promoting this webinar series and for maintaining our very informative website. A special thank you, very special, to Rowan Thornton of CFA District 14, our Zoom host, who again has done a great job and stuck with us. BRI will keep you informed about our website content and the way it's developing. And thank you very much for participating with us, and thank you both for your fabulous contribution. Good night.